When I reached out to help my stepson with something as simple as fixing his belt, I had no idea it would ignite a tension I couldn't ignore. What happens when an innocent moment turns into something far more dangerous, threatening the fragile lines of family and morality? This is a story of forbidden emotions, impossible choices, and the consequences of crossing boundaries. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The moment started innocently enough. He stood in the kitchen, fiddling with his belt, frustration etched across his face. "Can you help me with this?" he asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone who trusted me completely. I hesitated, but only for a second. Of course. It was harmless. He was my stepson, after all. As I moved closer, I noticed the subtle changes in him that had crept in over the past few months. He wasn't the gangly teenager I had met years ago when his father and I first got together. Now, at 19, he was tall, confident, and far more self-assured than the boy I remembered. I had watched him grow, but seeing him this close made those changes undeniable. His strong jawline, broad shoulders, and the way his t-shirt clung to his toned chest. They were details I had noticed before, but had always brushed aside. I reached out, my hands steady as I worked the clasp of his belt. "This thing is tricky," I said, keeping my voice light to diffuse the strange awareness creeping over me. He chuckled softly, standing so close that I could feel the heat radiating off him. And then it happened. As I tugged at the stubborn buckle, his boxers shifted slightly, exposing just a sliver more of his waist than I was prepared for. My hand froze. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it. "Thanks," he said casually, stepping back once the belt was fixed. I managed a small smile, but my thoughts were racing. I turned away quickly, busying myself with a nearby counter, pretending I hadn't noticed anything unusual. But I had. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the image, the sudden flash of his skin, and the way my stomach had nodded in response. It was ridiculous, I told myself over and over. It was nothing, just an accident. Yet the moment lingered, hanging in the air between us like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. As the night deepened and I retreated to my room, I realized I had avoided looking at him again. I told myself it was because I didn't want to embarrass him or myself, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, haunted by a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite name, something dangerous. Tomorrow would be normal, I resolved. Tomorrow I would forget. But as sleep finally claimed me, I knew it wasn't a promise I could keep. The next morning, I woke up determined to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. The house was quiet, save for the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I took a deep breath, willing myself to approach the day as if nothing had happened. It was easier to focus on the familiar rhythm of chores and the comforting predictability of my routine. But as I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, standing by the counter sipping coffee like he owned the place. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying that casual warmth that always made him seem so effortlessly at ease. "Morning," I replied, busying myself with the coffee pot. I felt his eyes on me, and even though I told myself it was my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling. "Thanks for helping with the belt last night," he added, a faint grin playing on his lips. "I swear, I think that thing's out to get me." His light-heartedness should have been disarming, but it only made me more aware of him. I forced a laugh. "Well, maybe it's time to get a new one." He shrugged. "Maybe, or I could just keep you around to fix it for me." The comment hung in the air for a moment, and I wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't inappropriate, not exactly, but there was something in his tone that made my heart race. I quickly changed the subject, asking him about his plans for the day. He launched into a story about meeting up with friends, his words washing over me as I focused on steadying my breathing. As the day wore on, I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction. The way he leaned against the counter while we talked, his laugh echoing through the house, the way he seemed to fill every space he occupied, it was all too much. I kept reminding myself that he was just a boy, my husband's son, and that these thoughts were nothing more than a symptom of my own loneliness. That evening, my husband came home late, as usual. He barely acknowledged me, muttering something about work before retreating to his study. It was the same routine every night. The man who had once swept me off my feet was now a ghost in our marriage. His presence felt more as an obligation than a partnership. We hadn't shared a meaningful conversation in months, and the distance between us felt insurmountable. After dinner, I found myself sitting on the couch, flipping through channels without really watching anything. My stepson wandered into the room, plopping down next to me with a casual ease that I envied. "Anything good on?" he asked, his shoulder brushing against mine as he leaned closer to see the screen. "Not really," I replied, my voice betraying the nervousness I felt. He didn't move away, and I didn't know if it was intentional or if I was just reading too much into it. Either way, my pulse quickened. We settled on a movie, something light and comedic, but I couldn't focus. Every laugh, every shared glance felt charged with a tension I didn't know how to navigate. I found myself hyper-aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. When the credits finally rolled, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Good choice," he said, his smile easy and genuine. He stood, stretching in a way that made me look away quickly, ashamed of where my eyes had drifted. "Thanks," I muttered, fumbling for the remote to turn off the TV. He lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but then he nodded and headed upstairs. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the blank screen and trying to make sense of the storm brewing inside me. It wasn't just him, it couldn't be. It was the loneliness, the emptiness of a marriage that had long since lost its spark. I tried to convince myself that I was projecting my frustrations onto him, that these feelings were nothing more than a desperate attempt to fill the void. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and awkwardness. I tried to keep my distance, finding excuses to stay busy or leave the house when he was around. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. He was everywhere. In the way he filled the kitchen with laughter, in the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in the living room, in the casual way he spoke to me like we were equals. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when he walked in, shirtless and damp from a shower. He stopped in the doorway, a towel slung over his shoulder, and grinned. "Hey, didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice light and unbothered. I froze, my hands gripping the fabric in front of me. "It's fine," I managed to say, keeping my eyes firmly on the pile of clothes. But I could feel him, watching me, his presence filling the room like a weight I couldn't ignore. "Need any help?" he offered, taking a step closer. "No, I've got it," I replied quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen and disappeared back upstairs. I sank onto the couch, my heart pounding. This couldn't go on. I needed to get a grip, to remind myself of who I was and what was at stake. But every time I thought about confronting these feelings, about putting a stop to this before it spiraled out of control, I hesitated, because part of me didn't want it to stop. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind, I made a decision. I would find a way to set boundaries, to distance myself emotionally and physically from my stepson. It was the only way to protect him, to protect myself, to protect our family. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the memory of his smile, the way his eyes lingered, just a little too long. The unspoken connection that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I told myself it was just a passing phase, a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. Over the next week, my resolve to create distance wavered with every passing moment. Avoidance was difficult in a house where our paths crossed constantly. Morning coffee in the kitchen, brief exchanges of pleasantries, and those fleeting glances that spoke louder than either of us dared to admit. It all felt like walking a tightrope. It was late one evening when things began to unravel. My husband was working late, as he often did, and I was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and a book, trying to distract myself. I heard him coming down the stairs, his footsteps unhurried. He appeared in the doorway, dressed casually in a t-shirt and sweats, holding a bowl of popcorn. "Movie night?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. I hesitated, searching for an excuse, but none came to mind. "Sure," I replied, forcing a smile. He plopped down on the couch beside me, setting the bowl between us. The movie he picked was one of those action-packed thrillers that normally would have kept my attention, but tonight my focus was elsewhere. Every shift of his body, every brush of his arm against mine sent a jolt through me. I tried to stay composed, keeping my eyes on the screen, but it was impossible to ignore the tension simmering between us. Halfway through the movie, he leaned forward to grab the remote, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the air like an unspoken confession. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us moved. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the silence. "I've noticed you've been avoiding me," he said finally, his voice low and measured. The accusation caught me off guard, and I stumbled for a response. "I haven't," I began, but he cut me off. "You have," he insisted, his gaze piercing. "Did I do something wrong?" His question was so genuine, so earnest, that it broke something inside me. I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. "No, of course not. It's just, things have been a little hectic." He frowned, his brow furrowing. "You can talk to me, you know. I mean, I know I'm not your kid, but I care about you." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and I felt the walls I'd built around my emotions begin to crack. I wanted to tell him everything, that it wasn't him, that the problem was me, that I was the one struggling with feelings I had no business having. But I couldn't. Instead, I nodded, offering him a weak smile. "I know," I said softly. "Thank you." The rest of the movie passed in a haze, neither of us fully paying attention. When it ended, he lingered for a moment before standing. "Good night," he said, his tone gentle. "Good night," I replied, watching him leave the room. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, grappling with the storm of emotions swirling inside me. The following day, the tension reached its peak. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when he came in. He was wearing that same easy smile, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a subtle intensity that hadn't been there before. "Can I ask you something?" he said, leaning against the counter. I glanced at him warily, drying my hands on a towel. "Of course." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Do you feel weird around me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. My throat tightened, and I struggled to find a response. "Why would you ask that?" I deflected, my voice shaky. He shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're trying to avoid me. And other times..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Other times what?" I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Other times it feels like you're not," he admitted, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with unspoken truths. My heart raced as I searched his face for clues, for any indication of what he was really thinking, but his expression was unreadable, a mix of vulnerability and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "I don't know what you mean," I said finally, my voice trembling. It was a lie, and we both knew it. He straightened, his jaw tightening. "Okay," he said simply, turning to leave. But as he reached the doorway, he paused, glancing back at me. "I just want you to know, I'd never want to make you uncomfortable." The sincerity in his voice was a knife to my chest, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. "You don't," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening, and then he was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind. His words, his tone, the look in his eyes, it all haunted me. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I didn't know how to step back. Every time I tried, something pulled me closer, like a moth to a flame. The following evening, it all came to a head. My husband was out of town for the weekend, and I was alone in the house. Or at least, I thought I was. I had just finished a long shower when I heard a knock at the bathroom door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Sorry," his voice came from the other side, muffled but unmistakable. "Didn't realize you were in there." "It's fine," I called back, my voice shaky. I wrapped a towel around myself and opened the door, finding him standing there, his expression apologetic. "I was looking for something," he explained, holding up a stray towel. "Didn't mean to bother you." "It's okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Our eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. The tension between us crackled like static electricity, and I felt my resolve slipping. "Good night," he said finally, stepping back. But he didn't move away, not entirely. He lingered in the hallway, his gaze searching mine, as if waiting for something. Permission, perhaps, or a sign that I felt the same pull he did. I stepped back into the bathroom and closed the door, my heart pounding. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, eyes wide with a mix of fear and something far more dangerous. I knew then that the line I had been so desperate not to cross was no longer in sight. The next morning, the tension was palpable. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind heavy with the events of the previous night. The fleeting moment outside the bathroom door had replayed in my mind over and over, every look, every second etched into my memory. I resolved to carry on as if nothing had happened. The line between us might have blurred, but I couldn't let it dissolve completely, not when so much was at stake. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels too loud. I lingered in the kitchen, pouring myself a second cup of coffee, hoping the familiar routine would calm my nerves. When he finally appeared, his steps slow and deliberate, I couldn't help but feel like he was testing the waters, gauging the energy in the room before speaking. "Morning," he said, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something more. Uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe anticipation. "Morning," I replied, my tone clipped as I kept my focus on the steaming mug in my hands. I didn't dare look up, afraid of what I might see in his gaze, or what he might see in mine. "Sleep okay?" he asked, and I heard the chair scrape lightly against the floor as he sat at the table. "Fine," I lied. I hadn't slept at all. He didn't press further, and the silence between us stretched on. I busied myself with washing a few dishes, desperate for something to occupy my hands. I thought he would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he lingered, his presence heavy in the room. "I was thinking," he began, his voice softer now. "We haven't really talked. Like, really talked. Not since I moved back." The words caught me off guard, and I finally turned to face him. He looked vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. His shoulders slightly hunched, his hands clasped loosely on the table. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. His brows knit together, and I instantly regretted the harshness. "I just feel like," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind." I sighed, setting down the dish I was holding. "What do you feel like?" He hesitated, his gaze locking onto mine. "I feel like things have been weird between us." My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay composed. "You're imagining things," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Am I?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. There was a challenge in his tone, but also a plea, as if he needed me to acknowledge what we both knew but refused to say. I couldn't do this. Not here. Not now. I grabbed my coffee and muttered something about needing fresh air before retreating to the backyard. The cool morning breeze did little to calm my racing heart. I stared at the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the wind, their simplicity a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I thought I was alone, but moments later I heard the soft creak of the patio door. He stepped outside, his footsteps hesitant. He stood a few feet away, giving me space, but not enough to ignore him. "Why are you running away from me?" he asked, his voice steady now. I turned to face him, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. "I'm not running away," I said weakly. "You are," he insisted, "and I don't understand why." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? How could I admit to feelings I had no right to have? "I care about you," he said suddenly, his voice raw. "And I don't mean just as family. I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." The admission hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. My chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing swirling within me. "You don't know what you're saying," I whispered, though his words had struck a chord deep within me. "I do," he said firmly, taking a small step closer, "and I think you feel it too." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "We can't do this. It's wrong. It's impossible." "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of him? He doesn't even see you. He doesn't appreciate you." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "This isn't about him." "Then what is it about?" he pressed, his eyes searching mine. "It's about us," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's about what this would mean, what it would destroy. I can't be that person." He took another step closer, his proximity both thrilling and terrifying. "You're not that person," he said softly. "You're human. You're allowed to feel." "I can't," I repeated, my voice trembling. "I can't do this to him, to you, to myself." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that sent shock waves through my entire body. I pulled away quickly, but the damage was done. The line we had danced around for weeks had been crossed, and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." I shook my head, tears spilling over. "It's not your fault. This is on me." He stepped back, giving me the space I so desperately needed. "I'll stay out of your way," he said, his tone resigned. I want you to be happy." As he walked away, I felt a pang of loss so profound it left me breathless. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. He had retreated to his room, and I didn't see him for the rest of the day. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I realized that the cracks in my marriage had become chasms. I thought about the choices I had made, the moments I had let slip away, and the feelings I had tried so hard to deny. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. The following days were a blur of avoidance and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. He kept his promise to stay out of my way, but his absence was just as loud as his presence had been. The silence between us was deafening, and I felt its weight in every corner of the house. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a fiery confession that brought things to a head. It was a quiet realization, a moment of clarity that came as I watched him pack his bags, preparing to return to college. He didn't say much, and neither did I, but as he stood in the doorway, ready to leave, he paused. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You too," I replied, my throat tight. And then he was gone, leaving behind an emptiness I couldn't quite explain. I stood there for a long time after the door closed, the weight of his absence settling over me. I didn't know what the future would bring, but as I turned back toward the quiet house, I knew one thing for certain: the choices we make, no matter how small, can change everything.